Hello, and welcome all to Movie Hunter, the show that tracks down the quality of all sorts of movies. My name is Hunter, and today in the 57th episode, our target is The Dark Crystal. Produced by ITC Entertainment and Henson Associates, and distributed by Universal Pictures, Associated Film Distribution, and United International Pictures. In a snowed-in airport hotel, Jim Henson wrote his ideas for The Dark Crystal into a 25-paged story titled The Crystal. The draft contained many of the elements that would be found in the final product. According to co-director Frank Oz, Jim Henson's intention with the film was to return to a certain darkness, like that presented in Grimm's fairy tales, believing it to be unhealthy for children to never be afraid. Many of the philosophical tones in the film were inspired by Jane Roberts' collections of writings, which Jim Henson found to be very inspirational, insisting that fantasy illustrator Brian Froud and screenwriter David Odell read it before joining the film. Originally, the fictional race of the Skeksis were going to speak their own language, but the idea was dropped upon test screenings, proving the captions to be too distracting. This original version can be seen in a few scenes in various DVD releases. Jim Henson and Frank Oz chose to not voice their puppeteered characters, believing that their voices would be too recognizable from their characters on The Muppets. When filming was completed, its release was delayed when Lou Grade sold ITC Entertainment to Robert Holmes Court, who was skeptical of the film's potential, given its bad reactions at the preview. The Dark Crystal was granted limited money for advertising and releasing until Jim Henson bought the rights back and released it with his own money. Brian Froud was chosen as concept artist after Jim Henson saw a painting of his in the book Once Upon a Time. The characters were not based on humans or any other Earth creatures, being elaborate puppets and using advanced animatronics, with the film being billed as the first live-action film without any humans on screen. The film was released on December 17, 1982 in the United States, and on February 17, 1983 in the United Kingdom. It made $41.4 million on a budget of $25 million, and was met with mixed reviews, though it became more and more popular over the years. The film was directed by Jim Henson and Frank Oz, and the screenplay was by David Odell. The story was by Jim Henson, who was also a producer alongside Gary Kurtz. The cinematographer was Oswalt Morris, the editor was Ralph Kemplin, and the music was by Trevor Jones. The puppeteers include Jim Henson, Catherine Mullen, Frank Oz, Dave Goelz, Steve Whitmire, Louise Gold, and Brian Mewell. The voice actors include Stephen Garlick, Jerry Nelson, Lisa Maxwell, Billy Whitelaw, Barry Dennen, Percy Edwards, Michael Kilgariff, Vic Wilson, and Sean Barrett. In 2019, a prequel series called The Dark Crystal: Age of Resistance premiered on Netflix. The film takes place on the planet of Thra, which, 1,000 years ago, was green and good until the crystal cracked, leaving a shard missing. With that, two new races appeared, the cruel Skeksis and the gentle Mystics. Among the Mystics is a gelfling named Jen, whose family was killed by the Skeksis. The Mystics and the Skeksis were both once great, but nowadays both numbered down to 10. The leader of the Mystics is dying and tells Jen about the Great Conjunction, where the three suns will meet and put the world into a time of testing, whether things will turn out good or bad. Jen is told to fulfill the prophecy by piecing the crystal back together, but first must retrieve the piece from someone named Agra. As the Mystic leader dies, the Skeksis leader simultaneously dies back at the castle of the crystal. This leads to the Skeksis general successfully taking his place after defeating the Chamberlain in the trial by stone, and the Chamberlain being banished. Upon hearing of Jen's quest, the general sends out their army of crab-like Gartham soldiers, and the Chamberlain secretly follows. Meanwhile, Jen finds Agra, who gives him the shard, but is interrupted before she can explain further, when the Gartham soldiers destroy her home and take her captive, with Jen escaping. Back home, the mystics hear the crystal calling and begin to make their way to the castle. In the forest swamp, Jen meets a female gelfling named Kira, who was raised by a race called the Podlings. Jen, Kira, and her pet Fizzgig are able to escape when the Gartham attack the Podling village, with some assistance from the Chamberlain. The Chamberlain approaches them, begging to be trusted and to follow him to the castle to make peace, but they run away from him. In the catacombs of the castle, the Chamberlain approaches them once more, only to be cut in the hand by Jen by the crystal shard, where we are shown that a mystic has received a cut as well. The Chamberlain crushes Jen and takes Kira to the new emperor to drain her essence and become young again. With help from Agra, Kira gets them all freed by calling for the captive animals to help. The Skeksis watching them is thrown into some nearby flames, where we are shown a mystic is suddenly vanishes. Jen awakes and the two gelflings make their way to the crystal. Kira is fatally wounded, but Jen reunites the shard with the crystal as the three suns meet, making the world right again. Just then, the mystics arrive and merge with the Skeksis, turning into angelic beings. The leader tells Jen that they unbalanced the world when they broke the crystal, splitting them into mystics and Skeksis. As a reward for Jen fixing everything, they revive Kira, and the world is made green and good again. Let's start by talking about what doesn't really work for me with this film, by talking about Jen, Kira, and the bland story. First of all, I found Jen to be a very boring protagonist. His design is certainly unique, but that's kind of a given for this film. And to top it all, he's probably the least appealing one to look at, to me at least, which is pretty unfortunate given that he is the most frequent character we see. I will give the film this. Jen is a very soft-spoken character, which fits very well not only with other Jim Henson projects, but makes him quite distinct in the world of Thra, where most creatures have a rough voice or shriek and things of that nature. It also makes him hard to dislike, but I was ultimately left with the sense of him being a blank slate by the end of it. In a very similar manner, Kira is a typical love interest character. Romance has never been a favorite genre of mine, and Jim Henson projects have very rarely been able to win me over in this regard. Kermit the Frog and Miss Piggy have the advantage in this regard with being able to rely on comedy and also the charming nature of their characters, neither of which are advantages that are granted to Jen and Kira. Other than that, Kira just kind of felt like a strange and ultimately unnecessary character to include. She only comes in this film about a third of the way through, and while it's initially cool to see another gelfling unscathed by the Skeksis, nothing really ever comes of it from it. There is this one thing I found to be very interesting, though, and I'd like to elaborate on it for a minute. When Jen and Kira first meet, the strangest scene in the entire film takes place, in which the two share each other's memories in something that Kira describes as dream fasting. When I first saw this, I was left extremely confused and thought that this was a really lame way for the two characters to know more about each other. While a lot of those feelings still remain, reflection on my part has done the scene some more good. If you haven't been able to tell by this point, The Dark Crystal is an immensely strange and peculiar film, and while some people really vibe with that, I don't think I am one of those people. When something is strange, that's what it is to me. Strange, and therefore bad. I've since come to see the flaw in that way of thinking. The most prominent thing... I've since come to see the flaws in that way of thinking. The most prominent being that there is a certain charm and magic that comes from strangeness like this. A feeling that isn't easily explained and needs to be felt more than anything. So, while this scene, and the film in multiple ways, contains this strangeness that isn't exactly my thing, I can certainly appreciate the magic that lies within it. I will say, though, similar to a complaint I had with Markiplier's Iron Lung, I think that I personally could have been more invested if we were just given a little bit more information, and weren't left in the dark about too many things. But I'll get more into that later. That brings us to the overall story. And likewise, it is rather bland and uninspired in my opinion. I think that the whole chosen one trope is done to poor effect with Jen, and the prophecy angle certainly doesn't help things. The idea that the three suns will meet to make the great conjunction which will determine the fate of the world is a tad bit interesting, with a bit of uniqueness thrown in there, but not enough to really carry the plot or enough to stray my mind from films with similar premises. All in all, the plot and story are rather lackluster, and Jen and Kira fall really close to the blank slate category. Luckily, we can now move on to the better parts of the film by talking about the mystics and the Skeksis, along with the creative elements of the film. First of all, the Skeksis have probably my favorite design of any of the characters in this movie, with their designs really carrying the fact that they're evil. I like the Mystics' designs too, though, with their three arms being something that I didn't love at first, but grew to like and appreciate as the film went on. Story-wise, I feel like the biggest missed opportunity with them was with them individually. It's never really said, but each Skeksis has a mystic counterpart, and each have a specific role to play in their respective communities. I haven't delved too deeply into it, but there is an entire story at play here that this film barely scratches the surface of. As is, the only member of either race to really distinguish themselves from the rest are the Chamberlain. Speaking of, the Chamberlain plays a pretty interesting role in the film, trying to trick Jen and Kira into thinking that he's offering peace, which he really has no such intention. I was fairly convinced that he was going to have a redemption of sorts, but nope, he was just lying. I think that's actually quite interesting, and plays into the darker tones of the film that I want to talk about more in a bit. Last thing on the two races, I think that the way the connection between them is slowly built up is simply brilliant. It's an excellent example of a slow burn reveal in a movie, where it is established pretty early on that there is a connection between them, but it's never immediately obvious. But it stays in the viewer's mind because the film keeps making reference to it. You've got the leader of each clan dying simultaneously. By the way, I like how the mystic peacefully fades while the Skeksis gruesomely crumbles. Then we see the cut on the Chamberlain's hand affect a mystic, and most brutally, a Skeksis is thrown into a pit of fire, and a mystic spookily disappears. While the two races merging at the end is quite strange, I feel like the whole mystery really balances that line well, with what information it gives to the audience and how much it keeps a secret, to leave the audience with some of that mystery. Going back to the darkness of this film, it really shocked me just how much violent and scary material was in here. As I've already mentioned, the design of the Skeksis is quite spooky, and the death of the leaders shows that death isn't impossible in this film. But what really got to me was the fate of the Landstriders, the creatures that Jen and Kira ride for a portion of the film, who have similarly great designs. The Gartham soldiers, who are also quite cool in design, attack them, with one Landstrider falling off a cliff with one of the soldiers in a very violent fashion, and the other Landstrider is attacked by multiple Gartham soldiers in a manner that is way too similar to the first episode of The Walking Dead, where Rick's horse is torn apart. There are many other examples of this, but I think that this is perhaps the most notable. It got to the point where, when Fizzgig, the dog-like creature, seemingly dies, I was fully convinced that they had really killed him. Fizzgig is also a fun character, by the way. Overall, I really like these creative elements, not being afraid to reach a much darker tone than the Muppets ever did. The Skeksis and Mystics are really cool creatures that I wish we got to see/learn more of. These creative elements really do wonders for the film, and bring together a film that is truly and deeply peculiar. I give The Dark Crystal a 7 out of 10, for being a movie that I can totally see being something people really get into, but for me personally, misses a few too many marks here and there. Reflection since watching it for the first time has definitely done the film some good though, as there is truly a lot to appreciate here, but at the same time it won't be everybody's cup of tea. A marvel of a film with breathtaking practical effects, but also a really bizarre film. I'm really glad I checked it out, but it isn't also exactly my thing. I would be interested in watching it again though, every once in a while. And that Netflix show does sound interesting, because I've heard good things, and I'd love to learn more about this world. Well, that's all, folks. I hope you enjoyed, and feel free to share any opinions you had on the movie. A new episode releases each week, so stay tuned to see which film I cover next. And in case I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.